that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I was hoping to be there with you in person in Cleveland, but do have high levels of COVID in my region and even in my neighborhood and street. So decided not to bring it to you. So for some background, in 2018, I started a project in HL7 sponsored by CDS, CQI, and BRR work groups to extend FHIR to evidence-based medicine knowledge assets, specifically to extend FHIR to support communication and data exchange of research results and guidance based on the research results. Stimulated by COVID and giving a lot more need to make science computable, I shifted careers and am working on this full time now and have started a small company, Computable Publishing LLC, a nonprofit organization, Scientific Knowledge Accelerator Foundation. And the EBMonFHIR project has grown to become a COVID knowledge accelerator virtual group meeting with 11 active working groups meeting 12 times per week. And this is all posted and open, and you can join us for any of that activity. So today's goal is to focus on this new FHIR resource, Artifact Assessment in R5. And specifically by the end of this session, I hope you will understand when a resource is needed to exchange data representing an assessment of another resource, and how to interpret the artifact assessment structure definition. I will go through these slides relatively quickly to allow much more time for discussion, but if you have questions that you want to ask, I do not mind being interrupted during the presentation. When we're done with the slides, I can also go to live if we want to see any of this content in interactive form. So what is an artifact assessment? The resource provides one or more comments, classifiers, or ratings about a resource. So this is data about a knowledge artifact, and I will sometimes call the rated knowledge artifact or the knowledge artifact this is data about as the rated artifact. This resource, the Artifact Assessment Resource, supports attribution and rights management metadata for the value-added content, the content of the Artifact Assessment Resource, which is distinct from the attribution and rights management of the rated artifact. So when is data about data more data, and when is data about data metadata? So consider a knowledge artifact that is a decision support file. It can have a size, it can have a concept that it worked well for me, it can run with a certain program, it could have a rate of a certain finding, it could be created by an entity, it could be tested by an entity, it could meet 5 of 7 criteria for something. Which of these things are metadata, which is data about the knowledge artifact? Well, if you look carefully, some of these things are directly about the knowledge artifact that we would consider metadata, like size, what it runs with, who created it. But many of these are assessments by someone other than the creator of the knowledge artifact, and that may be more value-added data and not simply metadata. So again, what is an artifact assessment? As written in its intro, this resource provides one or more comments, classifiers, or ratings about a resource and supports attribution and rights management metadata for the added content. Now, artifact assessment has 6 syllables and 18 characters. So that's a lot to keep saying. So essentially, it is a comment, a rating, a classifier, a combination of these things. So a shorthand abbreviation for this is CROC. 1 syllable, 4 characters, and I may refer to the artifact assessment instances as CROCs. And if you're impressed with an artifact assessment instance that you see, you can respond with "what a CROC." So when do we need an artifact assessment resource? One reason is when the rights management for the CROC differs from the rights management for the rated artifact. If you cannot update the rated artifact when you create or update the CROC, you need a separate resource for the CROC. If you need different view permissions, who can view the rated artifact and who can view the CROC, you need a separate resource for the CROC. Another reason is when the attribution or metadata about the comment is not supported in the rated artifact. In a number of resources we created, we use a note element with an annotation data type. The annotation data type supports a reference or display of the name of the author, supports the time the annotation was made, and a text element for the content of the annotation. But if you want to give any other attribution, reviewers, editors, or any other metadata to the annotation, then we need another resource for it. And then finally, when the content of the CROC is not supported in the rated artifact, and I will show you an example where we need compound classifiers or more involved things than Codable Concept can handle. So we use CROCs or artifact assessment resources to add that additional functionality. So I'm going to show you several examples of things we can do with the artifact assessment resource. The first set of example is being able to comment on a thing or being able to vote on a thing. And in this example, the thing is a term in development. We are building a scientific evidence code system or terminology. And in the process of building it, we've set up ways so that people can comment on the terms or vote on the terms. So this is an example. We're looking at the FEvIR platform, Fast Evidence Interoperability Resources. Consider evidence instead of health for this use of FHIR data exchange. And on the FEvIR platform, we are viewing a code system resource. We can look at the JSON view if you want to see the raw JSON for the code system resource, but we have a code system viewer with a text view for a more human readable approach. And we made a term detail view. And we happen to be looking at a single term with the code SEVCO 01035. The display or preferred term is phase 3 trial. We have a definition, alternative terms, comments, other properties. You can see here we're using properties to even document at this moment. When the screenshot was captured, there were 3 different times an expert working group voted and had some comments. Let's keep working on it. And we keep doing this until we have 100% agreement for the term. You'll notice there is a comment button. Anyone is welcome to comment on these terms. And if we click the comment button, it's a simple dialog box. You can type in your comment and it takes the username from where you're logged in and says it's a comment on this term by this person. And you type in your comment, you click submit. There's also a vote button and anyone can join the expert working group. And then we seek 100% yes in the votes. If you click the vote button, you really have 2 data points, a choice, yes or no, and you can add a comment if you wish, click submit. We are doing enough of this that we created a My Ballot tool, so you can see all the terms open for vote, choose yes or no, add comments if you wish. And then when you submit this, every row here creates a different, distinct artifact assessment resource. I will come back to that and show you how we use it behind the scenes. Another example of an artifact assessment resource is a rating or multiple ratings of a thing. So in the next 2 examples, one thing is a scientific article or research finding, and the ratings we've created are different aspects of looking at the risk of bias in this research. So these are examples of a risk of bias assessment. Another example I will show you, the thing is a recommendation in a clinical practice guideline, and the ratings document the judgments of the guideline development panel the justification behind the recommendation. So in one example of a risk of bias assessment, here showing the human-friendly view and the risk of bias assessment reader, but behind it is an artifact assessment resource. At the high level, we have a risk of bias rating that was rated as moderate risk of bias. And you can see different types of bias in the details, some containing subtypes. And for each of these types, you see 4 different factors that were rated. And you see a summary, rationale in text to go along with each of the ratings. In another example here, this is a risk of bias assessment of a critically appraised summary of a specific outcome in a specific randomized trial. And overall, there was a serious risk of bias. The rationale stated was due to lack of blinding. And you can see not every rating has to be filled out. And in addition to the summary, you can see notes can occasionally be applied as well. So a lot of different ratings and comments could be compiled together in an artifact assessment resource. Here is an example of the justification. This is a German guideline recommendation for thromboprophylaxis in ambulatory patients with COVID. And you can see inside the artifact assessment, there's a component. This component is of type evidence, describing the evidence behind the recommendation. There's a related artifact to the evidence report, where you can see the summary of findings they looked at. Another component is the content is in German in the summary, but you can see a type of rating is a certainty of evidence rating, and the classifier in this case is very low for the certainty of evidence. One last type of example of artifact assessment resource is the classification of a thing. The thing in this example is a scientific article, and the classifications are medical subject headings or mesh headings. And mesh headings have qualifier codings, so a simple codable concept approach does not represent the full complex mesh heading. So here we have a citation resource. We're looking in the citation viewer, and many concepts can be handled with simple classifiers. A classification in citation has a type, publishing model in the first example, and a classifier value, which has a code for print electronic. Publication type has 2 classifiers, a journal article and a meta-analysis. But for the mesh headings, we have the primary term listed here, bariatric surgery, case control studies. Each of these terms may have qualifiers, and whether the term is a major topic or is not a major topic is a separate concept than the term itself, so that's a qualifier. Some of these terms have qualifiers like complications or surgery, and then the qualifiers can be further qualified as being a major topic or not. So we see the structure here, compound qualified codings or classifications. And we also see attribution, although the attribution is not stated here. The concept that this classification is free to share is being shown here, which could be a different space for rights management concepts. So all of those are examples of how we have used artifact assessment resource for many different functional purposes. What I will now do is go through the structure definition, the 19 elements in the structure definition of artifact assessment resource, describe them relatively briefly so there can be more time for questions and answers if there's parts you want to go into in more detail. So the first part of the artifact assessment resource we can think of as the metadata for the artifact assessment itself, any number of identifiers. If you have a reason to cite the artifact assessment, maybe there's a reason to cite the comment or rating, you can use a citation reference for it or just put in Markdown how you wish to cite this comment. The date element for when the resource itself was last changed, and other date elements if you want to mark when this rating is approved or when it was last reviewed. And if you need to describe anything regarding rights management, you can use the copyright element and put it there. We then have a required element, artifact, to note the rated artifact. If you do not have a rated artifact, then an artifact assessment resource doesn't make sense on its own. And you can use a reference data type to define the rated artifact. If you really only have text, you just use the display part alone of reference data type. You can use a canonical URL to it, or just any URL as another way of noting the rated artifact. The content, I will circle back through and go through the pieces in more detail, but this is the major portion of the content. The content itself can be recursive. You see component uses the content structure, and you could have any number of content instances and any number of components. In specialized cases, you see information type of the content is often a comment, a classifier, a rating, a container, which may contain more than one of these things, but sometimes it can be a response or a change request. And at that unique situation, there may be some workflow management related to the content. And for that, we've added workflow status and disposition codes mirrored to match the codes we use in JIRA if we end up using artifact assessment for those particular types of purposes. So if we now look at the content, the core of the artifact assessment resource, I will show you different approaches through these elements matching some of the examples that we saw. So the first example will be focusing on a comment. The information type will be comment. The main comment will be in a summary element, which is marked down to support, text comments. Author is optional, but you can reference who is authoring this content, this comment. And you'll notice author is in the content element, so it is possible to construct an artifact assessment with multiple content instances with different authors. And path can be used if you wish to comment on a part of the rated artifact and not the entire rated artifact. So we saw this comment on phase 3 trial, which is a part of the code system by an author, myself, and there's the content that was added. If we now look at this, you'll see the resource type is artifact assessment. The artifact reference is the code system resource. And the content in this comment has information type comment. Summary is the comment itself. The path is the code for the specific term being commented on. And the combination of artifact reference and path makes it very clear what this comment is about. And you see author with display. This is using the reference data type. In the handout, there is a error that we since corrected that just showed author as a string, but because author uses the reference data type, it would be author display and the string. Another use of artifact assessment is for a rating. If you want to explain or have a comment or rationale related to your rating, you can use the summary. But when using a rating, a common approach is to use the type element if you wish to express the aspect that is being rated, and a classifier element to provide the rating. And both type and classifier use codable concept data types. Again, this example will show the author and the path, and this example will have a component where the component is something specific to the rating that is being applied. So here we have the information type is rating. The type is a vote, letting us know this rating is a vote on the term. Path and author are similar here. The classifier is very simple for our voting system. It's either a yes or a no. But we include a component for the type, the term voted upon, and the summary is the preferred term followed by the definition, because as the terminology development evolves, we may change the term and definition and call for a revote. So we need a capture of exactly what was voted on, and it's simpler to capture it at the time than to create a whole lookup to go back and interrogate old votes and recalculate what do these votes go with. So this is how we've used the path and the component to be very precise in supporting our use of voting on the concepts in another knowledge artifact. Here's the example of justification for this German guideline recommendation. The artifact reference is to a plan definition resource where the recommendation is expressed. The content includes a summary, which is the German summary of the recommendation itself. And a component of this recommendation is a classifier, where the type is direction, the classifier is negative. This is a recommendation against thromboprophylaxis in mild cases. And here we see information type container, because the type for this component or content is evidence, and it will contain multiple things. You see components within it. We also see a related artifact element here, referencing an evidence report, which contains the summary of findings for the evidence supporting this recommendation. This is the example with mesh headings being provided in artifact assessment resources to provide additional classification value beyond what the citation resource handles in its direct structure. And the way that this ends up being handled is actually by creating an artifact assessment resource and then containing it in the contained element within the citation resource. So the artifact reference in this case has a reference simply being the pound symbol, and that is the method of referencing the parent resource when you are in a contained resource. You'll notice the information type is considered a classifier for this content. And the type is using a codable concept for the code mesh heading as defined in a cited artifact classification type code system. And we added some text to explain that components, if present, include the qualifier codings, and we'll see an example here. The classifier contains a code for the primary mesh heading, bariatric surgery. There's the free to share as a Boolean that was added for the content-specific rights management. And then you see a component with type qualifier, and the classifier in this example is major topic. So hopefully at this point, you've learned an understanding of when a resource is needed to exchange data representing an assessment of another resource. If the content includes a comment, classification, rating, question, or response, added content, added value data about another resource, and the target of the content is a knowledge artifact, that would be a key. And the reason you would use an artifact assessment resource to provide this added value content is either or both of the attribution or rights management for the added content differs from the target, or the artifact assessment provides structure and you may prefer to use that instead of creating extensions to provide the added structure. And hopefully you learned how to interpret the artifact assessment structure definition with a brief intro to the 19 elements. And I'm happy to take questions for that. This should be in the handout as well, but FEvIR.net if you want to go to the website with the platform for this, and the Alper at computablepublishing.com if you want to reach me directly.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that. Let's first start here with a question, maybe from Gustav. I will hand you the microphone.
Hi, Brian. Thanks. Yeah, great overview. I was sort of wondering, an issue which really comes up when sharing data in, let's say, data which has been raised in one trial, and then let's say somebody else wants to do analysis on that data and would like to use that data. So the information about which parts of the data and the rights of use of the data, would that be something which would be captured in that resource, or is it something which is out of scope?
Well, the data would be in whatever resource the data itself is contained in, and would have the rights management for that data. If you then made an additional comment, analysis, rating, classification of that data, you can then use an artifact assessment resource to document your assessment of the data, and then you can provide the rights management for your assessment of the data in the artifact assessment resource. But the artifact assessment resource is not meant for the original data. So for example, here, there is an evidence resource representing critically appraised summary of the primary outcome of the multi-platform randomized trial, of anticoagulation in non-critically ill adults with COVID. If we were to go to that rated artifact, you can see there's a summary of the evidence and the how to cite this evidence resource and the data source itself from a New England Journal article. And this describes the population in this evidence and who was included, who was excluded, the exposures, the outcomes, all expressed with evidence variable resources, the statistics that were found. The median adjusted odds ratio had this value with these attribute estimates and these model characteristics. Certainty is reproduced in the evidence resource here using a model that we have since built this into artifact assessment to be able to show who rated each part of the certainty components. And there's additional notes and there's classifiers, synthesis, and study type. The metadata is just the resource again in outline form of the JSON, and we could also view the JSON to see that. But let's assume this evidence is not something you have the rights management. You don't have the ability to change the rights management for this evidence, but you have now made an analysis of this evidence, and you create a risk of bias assessment of that evidence. And here in this example, you could see that the risk of bias assessment has a set of authors. The risk of bias assessment has a copyright statement. That is the copyright for the risk of bias assessment, not for the original evidence. And then you see a lot of detail with summary and notes for each of the many parts in this complex risk of bias assessment.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Can you? Oh, no, it's working again. Let me quickly look into FEvIR, but so far I don't also see any questions here. So it seems for now that we are all good. If you have any other questions, I'm sure that Brian is happy to answer them on FEvIR in the Q&A section. Just post that here, or I guess also then on Zulip. All right, thank you so much, and have a great DevDays. And again, thank you, Brian.
Okay.